Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to have your time for the next hour and hope you walk away feeling more confident in your knowledge of the new MUTCD and how it's being used. My name is Cameron Bennett, and I'm a transportation analyst in Kittleson's Portland, Oregon office. I will be your host for this conversation. We'll be talking about all things MUTCD, how it changed from the 10th to the 11th edition, and how those changes will affect projects in the various states that are adopting the new edition. Ultimately, we want to address the question, what does the new MUTCD mean for you and your projects? We're lucky that our speaker today happens to be the current chair of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, certainly one of the leading experts on this topic. As we prepared this presentation, it was important to us to hear the questions on your mind related to the new MUTCD. So we appreciate you sending in your questions in advance through the RSVP form. Gene has worked a lot of those questions into what he'll share today, and we'll also take time at the end of the webinar to address some of them directly. So be sure to stick around for that. While we will unfortunately not have time to answer all of the questions we received or address any questions that come up during the presentation, we'll do our best to address those that are most frequently asked. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Gene Hawkins. Gene is a senior principal engineer with Kittleson LLC in College Station, Texas, where he provides expert witness services for traffic control devices and related subjects. Gene is a professor emeritus at Texas A&M University, where he spent 17 years as a professor in the Zachary Department of Civil Engineering. Prior to his academic career, he was a researcher at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, where his research focused primarily on traffic control devices. Gene currently serves as the chair of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, a position he was first elected to in 2018. He has received numerous awards, including the 2018 American Road and Transportation Builders Association Jake Landon Memorial Safety Award, the 2012 ITE Wilbur S. Smith Distinguished Transportation Educator Award, the 2010 ITE Texas District Transportation Engineer of the Year Award, the 1998 TTI Trinity Outstanding Researcher Award, and several other teaching and best paper awards. Gene is the keeper of one of our industry's most extensive online guides to the MUTCD, which you can find at mutcd.kittleson.com. Gene, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thank you very much, Cameron, and welcome to all of you on this Tuesday, whether it be afternoon where you're at or still in the morning hours. I've been looking over the list of names of the attendees. Right now, we've got 134, and that number's growing. I see a number of old friends and some of my national committee friends, and a lot of people whose names don't look familiar. And so, especially to those people, I want to say welcome. We're going to try and go through the presentation and talk about my favorite subject, the MUTCD, and hopefully give you some insights into the manual and what's new. So first, I'm going to kind of talk about what it is, how we got to where we're at with the new MUTCD, what the states are able to do as far as how they go about adopting the manual. And there's a lot of new material in this manual. I have picked out a few key areas, a few key changes, and I'll talk about those. And then when you registered for this, you were able to list questions, and I've tried to address a lot of those questions in the presentation, but at the end, those questions that I didn't get to, I'll cover as many of them as I can. So what is the MUTCD? Well, if you want to actually say the whole name, it's a manual on uniform traffic control devices for streets and highways. And essentially, it is the national standard for traffic control devices used on roads open to public travel, and both private and public roads. It is the only traffic engineering reference that is cited in federal regulations and has a lot of information in it and a very long history. And I particularly enjoy getting into the historical aspects of the MUTCD. So in the new manual in section 1A01, and you'll see references to section numbers at the lower right corner of a number of slides. For the first time, the purpose of the manual is defined along with objectives for achieving that purpose. And so, as I said, it is the national standard. It establishes criteria for the design, the selection, the installation, the operation, and so forth of traffic control devices. And these national criteria have the objectives of promoting safety, inclusion, mobility, promoting efficiency. And note it says efficiency through uniformity in meaning and appearance. This is a subtle point that's lost in some of the clutter, but uniformity means doing things exactly the same every time. And then promote consistency in use, installation, and operation, whereas consistency is different than uniformity. Consistency basically means doing things at some minimum level or within a range. There is the opportunity for some variation. It doesn't have to be exactly the same every time. And then to provide basic principles note for traffic engineers to use in making decisions. The Federal Register notice for the final rule has some language talking about what the MUTCD is not. And FHWA was very specific in stating that it is not a road design manual. It is not a safety manual. It is not something that establishes policy to make one travel mode more important than another, or to tell communities how they should develop their own unique community character. It's not intended to influence or change access to land for any specific type of travel mode. As I said, I love getting into the history. I like to divide the history of the manual into 4 generations. The first generation was the initial manual in 35 and the War Edition manual in 42. Those were very, very similar. Then we got into a transition period of the 48 and 61 manuals, and these 2 manuals have a fair amount of difference between each of them, and there were fairly significant changes from one to the next. Then we got into what I call the mature edition, and this is essentially the same manual across all 3 editions, the 71, the 78, and the 88. It was just continuously revised and updated and then reprinted, so everything was all together. And then there was another generation. The size of the paper increased and the thickness of the manual increased. And we've had 4 different editions now in what I call the modern generation of the MUTCD. And if you're interested in looking at these old versions of the manual, you can find them on the mutcd.kittleson.com website. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's links to all of these. So how did we get from the 2009 to the 2023 MUTCD? Well, the 2009 manual existed with just a couple of revisions for a number of years. There were 2 revisions in 2012. There was a 3rd revision later on in 2022 after the NPA came out. And so, and I'm actually going to back up before I show you the NPA. During that 11 years, there was official experiments going on. There were research projects. A national committee developed over 200 recommended changes. FHWA was processing all of that information and preparing a draft document. And they published that draft MUTCD in December of 2020. The public had 5 months to comment on that. During that 5-month period, there were over 17,000 submissions to the docket. And if you break all those submissions down into individual comments, there were over 100,000 individual comments. It took almost 3 years for FHWA to review all those comments. And I'll talk about the 647 changes in a minute, but last December they published the 11th edition in a final rule. And when they published that final rule, they published what they call a summary of dispositions document that summarizes the changes between the proposed manual and the final manual for the 647 items that were deemed significant in the NPA as major or significant changes from the 2009 manual. And now states have a 2-year period that they get to figure out how they're going to adopt this new manual. And we're already approaching a quarter of the way through that 2-year period. And I mentioned the National Committee had over 200 recommendations. We also made 85 submissions to the docket. Basically, we had one submission for each chapter in that draft MUTCD. So I've mentioned the National Committee. Some of you may not be familiar with it. It is a National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's a private organization. It has its roots in a committee that was originally responsible for developing and maintaining the MUTCD before FHWA took ownership of the MUTCD in 1971. We have over 300 members. We meet twice a year in person, generally in January, the week before TRB, sometimes the same week as TRB, and then typically in June in coordination with the AASHTO Committee on Traffic Engineering. And essentially all we do in these meetings and our virtual meetings between our face-to-face meetings is develop proposed changes to the MUTCD. And I've already mentioned the 200 recommendations and 85 submissions. So of those 17,000 plus docket comments or submissions, there were quite a few of them that said FHWA needs to revise, reframe, and rewrite the MUTCD. There were some organizations that did not like the draft version of the MUTCD and sent out templates and suggested comments, docket comments to their members, and a lot of the docket comments that were submitted reflect that that campaign. There were, and I'll call them complaints, you can call them comments, but saying the MUTCD limits road design, or it limits our ability to determine land use or access and safety. There are a number of things, which is part of why FHWA included the language in the Federal Register final rule saying what the MUTCD isn't. There were a number of commenters that objected to using the 85th percentile speed for establishing speed limits. There were a number of commenters that said the MUTCD focuses too much on motorized transportation and needs to really focus more on bicycles and pedestrians. And comments that the MUTCD focuses on highways, rural areas more than cities. This has been a common complaint for probably as long as the MUTCD's been around there, and there is some validity to that issue. I'll talk about that later. There are a couple of websites that you may want to look at to get more information about this new manual, and there's really more than two, but two I want to focus on. One of them is the official FHWA MUTCD website, and I'll show you a screenshot of that page in the next couple of slides. But mutcd.fhwa.dot.gov, that's the home for the official version of the MUTCD. The PDF version is actually the official version. There is a markup of the 2009 to 2023 that shows the changes that were made, with red strike through for deletions and blue underline for additions. Their FHWA has done 2 webinars so far. Last time I looked, the recording of the first one had been posted. The recording of the second one, if it's not posted yet, should be posted at some point. And in the future, they will continue to post supporting information, such as the standard highway signs book or slides summarizing the major changes. The other thing I wanted to point out as a website you can go to is the one I've mentioned before, the Kittleson, mutcd.kittleson.com. We have tried to consolidate all of the information about the 2023 MUTCD on one page, so that you can get the Federal Register NPA and final rule documents, a summary of dispositions, the actual MUTCD, that markup document, and everything else from one page. On another page of our website is where we keep the scanned copies of old editions. And not only is it the original edition that was published, but also separate files for all of the revisions to that particular edition. So literally you can create the MUTCD for any specific point in time if you're so inclined. This is the FHWA page for the current edition. I'd encourage you to click on a lot of these different links on the left side of the page. This is where you'll find the markup and also the summary of dispositions file. And these are screenshots from a couple of the pages on the Kittleson MUTCD website. And this is where you'll find links to all those documents I was talking about. And we have links to all the prior MUTCD editions. So a few highlights in the final rule. I've made reference to the 647 significant changes. Those were listed in the NPA with a short description of why they were making or proposing to make those changes. And the final rule, FHWA decided to write differently this go round. And so instead of addressing each of these significant changes in the Federal Register, they ended up just providing a high level perspective of changes and a summary of a few key items, and then produced a summary of dispositions document. It's 270 something pages long that actually explains what they decided to do about each of those 647 items. In that final rule are some key aspects of it that include the intended use, and that's part of where that language about what the manual isn't, why they are conducting this regulatory action, which is the MUTCD is a regulation, and as I said, the summary of major things. So among the items that the Federal Register notice actually summarizes is some of the issues surrounding experimentation with traffic control devices, changes that were made in the definition of engineering study and engineering judgment and professional engineer. And if there's an asterisk there, I'm going to talk about those specific issues in a little more detail about setting speed limits. It probably comes as no surprise that there is new material in there regarding electric vehicles and signing for alternative fuels. There is content related to putting safety messages on changeable message signs. One of the things that was proposed in the NPA is to increase the width of a normal line to 6 inches, from 4 to 6 inches under certain circumstances. And in the final rule, FHWA said that they considered that and decided not to do it. So line widths, the requirement to increase line widths was not implemented. There are changes to crosswalk markings. The manual now covers how you can do aesthetic treatments to pavement surfaces. It talks about using colored pavement. It talks about, and there were a number of changes to signals. Among those are changes that improve accessibility and also accessibility within temporary traffic control zones. Pedestrian signals have a fair amount of changes. They added bicycle signals. There's a whole new part 5 on automated vehicles or traffic control devices for automated vehicles, and a lot of new bicycle signs and markings. So we'll cover some of those. But first, I want to talk about the options for states to adopt the manual and the deadlines and how that process works. So states have 3 choices. They can adopt the national MUTCD as it is for use in their state. They can adopt the national MUTCD and issue a state supplement, or they can create and adopt a state version of the MUTCD. And different states do different things. I'm going to show you a map here shortly of how that worked with the 2009 manual. But there have been some changes in the Code of Federal Regulations with respect to what you can and can't do in adopting a state MUTCD and or a supplement. And anything that's a shall or a should in the national manual must be the same in the state document. You cannot have other documents within the state that negate a shall or should in the MUTCD. And so to the extent that some of your other documents that you may have, such as specifications, traffic drawings, manuals, and so on and so forth, impact MUTCD content, this change in the language of the CFR means that those documents then are considered a supplement to the MUTCD. And the deadline for doing all of this is January 18th, 2026, which is 2 years after the effective date of the 2023 MUTCD. I can't tell you what specific states are doing at this time. We're not keeping a running tally. This is a map. It's on the FHWA website for the MUTCD about how the states handled the 2009 manual. The red is the states, the 18 states that adopted the national manual. The blue is the 22 states that have a state supplement, and the green is the 10 states that have a state MUTCD. Compliance states were a significant issue in the 2009 manual, and in one of those 2012 revisions, they deleted many of the compliance states. There are only 5 compliance or 6 compliance states, 5 new ones that are in the new MUTCD. And here's the list of them. These are addressed in part 1 of the new MUTCD. The key point I want to make about these compliance states is these dates don't change when a state issues its state supplement or state MUTCD. So essentially, those that are 1/18/2029, that's 5 years after effective date of the manual, and the clock is ticking on those regardless of whether your state has taken action to adopt the manual or not. And I'll talk about some more about adoption issues and design and so forth. The marking minimum retroreflectivity has a little bit different date, and it's an earlier date because that was based on the language in revision 3 of the 2009 manual. All right, so this is where I want to talk about what MUTCD should you be using. I would venture to state that most of the states, and certainly probably a majority of the states, are still using the 2009 manual or the state version that's based on the 2009 manual for traffic control devices in their state. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to cover what individual states are planning to do. I've actually heard of states that were starting off on going down one road and have decided to change their mind. So keep that in mind and check with your local state agency about what the plans are for adopting the MUTCD in your state. And whatever those plans are, it probably requires some formal adoption process. So even though the national manual is effective at the federal level, it may not be applicable in your state until the state goes through either legislative or administrative procedures to adopt it. And in some states, that might not be until late 2025 or even the first couple of weeks of January 2026. Keep in mind that the new manual does have language that says a roadway cannot or shall not be open to traffic unless the traffic control devices comply with the MUTCD. So a little bit kind of an overview of some of the changes at a high level before I get into specific changes. So about 300 pages have been added to the MUTCD in this new edition. There are some structural changes from the standpoint of how the content is organized. There are a lot more chapters. For example, Signals has now chapter letters that go up to U. So something like 22, 23 different chapters in Signals. And that's true in a number of the parts. Some of the prior content has had either material added or some deleted, or in some cases it's been revised. And there's a fair amount of new content. And so here are actually, I think there's 14. I did 12 when I was recently made this, and I forgot to change this slide. So I'm going to cover these real quick. So the first one is about being a professional engineer. And the manual has new language in there that, and this is a quote, and this is probably the only thing I'm quoting in this presentation, where the content of this manual requires a decision for implementation. Such decisions shall be made by an engineer or an individual under the supervision of an engineer. And the definitions of engineering judgment and engineering study have been revised to say that that means it is exercised by a professional engineer or under the supervision of a professional engineer. And the term professional engineer is defined as well. So this is, I think, an important recognition that traffic control devices are not something you just throw out there willy-nilly, that they are part of the engineering infrastructure and oftentimes require engineering judgment or engineering study in order to use properly. Lots of controversy about setting speed limits. And there is the final rule, the new manual retains some language on the factors to be considered in setting a speed limit. The 85th percentile is still there, but there are other factors that are also listed. In the Federal Register notice for the final rule, FHWA recognized that setting speed limits is not a traffic control device standard or criteria issue. It is really a traffic engineering practice. The only reason they kept that content in the MUTCD is because it's not any other place. But FHWA is working on developing a document on how to set speed limits, and the plan, as I understand it, is that they will post that on an FHWA website, and once it is posted, will likely remove this content in the MUTCD about how to determine the speed limit from the MUTCD and just reference that external document. On roundabouts, they took out the black and white chevron sign that was used in the central island, and that sign is replaced with either of the one-way signs. Crosswalk markings, the types of markings have been expanded, and some of them are defined as high visibility markings, and the language regarding the use of markings has been revised. So crosswalk markings are required, for example, at non-intersection crosswalks that are legally defined, and high visibility crosswalk markings are recommended at all non-intersection crosswalks. Then there is content in the MUTCD about how to provide aesthetic treatments. FHWA determined this was important to include because a number of agencies were placing treatments within crosswalks, particularly that conflicted with basic traffic control device principles. And so the MUTCD now establishes some criteria on how to do aesthetic treatments, what can be done and how to place them. And among the things that it says is that aesthetic treatments shall not use the official traffic control device colors. So white, yellow, red, orange, so on and so forth, are not to be used in aesthetic treatments. Pedestrian signals, the use of these signals has increased. It's recommended at all intersections that have marked crosswalks. They're required in the circumstances. You can see them listed there. And there is an entirely new chapter, and it's an entire chapter on accessible pedestrian signals. Bicycle signals are a brand new traffic control device, and these have been added to the MUTCD. And this content evolved from the interim approval on bicycle traffic signals that many agencies were using as a basis for installing these. Bicycle signal faces are only for use with bike lane or shared use paths. They do require the bicycle symbol in the indication. And it's worth noting that, and this is something some of my bicycle facility colleagues have told me, that what's in the MUTCD may be a little bit different than what some agencies are actually doing with regard to the use of bicycle signals. RRFBs were a really big deal for a while, and they were actually identified as an interim approval, which was then rescinded for patent issues, and then reinstated once the patent issues were resolved. And so you can now use RRFBs as part of a warning sign assembly. You can only use them on uncontrolled crosswalks or uncontrolled approaches, and you can use them with school trail crossings or at other locations where you have the downward diagonal arrow. Pedestrian hybrid beacons is a device that was added in the 2009 MUTCD. Some agencies really like these a lot. A lot of the early research was done at intersections with hybrid beacons. But in the 2009 manual, they were restricted to non-intersection locations. Well, in the 2023 MUTCD, they've removed that restriction, so you can now use them at intersections, and the volumes at which you can implement them have been reduced. I mentioned pedestrian issues at the beginning of this presentation, and one of the areas that you see the emphasis on the pedestrian movement, particularly those with low vision, is some of the typical applications and improved content for pedestrians in temporary traffic control zones. And the graphics you see on this slide are a couple of those that you'll find in part 6 of the MUTCD. The one on the left indicating the need for detection plates, both high and low, and the one on the right is part of what is in a typical application in an urban situation. And essentially what part 6 is saying is, if you have a sidewalk within a temporary traffic control zone, you have to provide alternate access. Now, if you close that sidewalk, you have to close it at a decision point. You can't just close it mid-block and to where a pedestrian would walk half the distance of the block, find out the sidewalk's closed, and have to go back to the intersection across the road. So a lot better treatment of pedestrian movement within temporary traffic control zones in the new MUTCD. Also, some new typical applications for roundabouts that have been added to part 6. Roundabouts can be really hard to deal with in a temporary traffic control situation where you have to do work on the interior of a roundabout. And so there are a couple of TAs that talk about how to go about doing that. Then bicycle facilities. I'm only going to do, I think, a couple of slides on bicycle facilities, but the amount of new content in this part of the MUTCD is significant. This part 9 has 2.5 more pages than part 9 in the 2009 manual. A lot of new signs, new markings, and other treatments, revisions to the existing content or the prior content that was in the 2009 manual. Some of the significant changes include shared lane signing, the green pavement marking for bicyclists. Earlier in the presentation, I talked about colored pavements, and there's really 2 colors that are getting a lot of attention: green for the bicycle facilities and red for transit facilities. And the new MUTCD recognizes those treatments. And then also part 9 has new bicycle lane markings. And so this is the only slide that I'm going to get into any detail on the bike facility traffic control. But if you're big on bicycles, I encourage you to look in part 9 and start reviewing that in detail to see all the tools that are available to you. They have added bicycle boxes and bicycle turn boxes. There is content that addresses buffered traffic control for buffered bicycle lanes, also for contraflow bicycle lanes and separated bicycle lanes. It's worth noting, because some agencies like to use or used to use the bicycle symbol that had the rider on the bike wearing a helmet, and that symbol is not in the new MUTCD, so it's not a valid symbol to use anymore, which that raises the issue of, well, if you have a traffic control device that is installed in your agency that is up and it doesn't comply with the new manual, do you have to go out and replace it right away? And the answer is no. There is language in Part 1 of the MUTCD that allow existing devices to continue to remain in place throughout their service life, that devices, traffic control devices, should be upgraded as part of a systematic approach. All right, I mentioned Part 5, which has changed from traffic control devices for low volume roads to traffic control device considerations for automated vehicles. And this part of the manual is significant because originally this was the impetus that got the federal government moving forward with developing and proceeding toward rulemaking for a new edition of the MUTCD. The 2009 manual had languished for quite a while with no urgency to move to rulemaking to improve it. And the advent of automated vehicles provided that impetus. The content that was in the old Part 5 has been basically scattered throughout the applicable portions of the manual where it was appropriate to do so. Most of the content in Part 5 is either support statements, options, or guidance statements. There is only one standard in all of Part 5, and that relates to scanning graphics that automated vehicles might be able to see, and a prohibition on those being visible to the naked eye. Most of what's in there is, here's what you ought to be considering as you move toward adopting automated vehicles. And so what's the future for the MUTCD? Well, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, or IIJA, includes language that says the MUTCD, essentially says MUTCD has to be updated at least every 4 years. I think in the near future, we're looking at those updates being a revision of the 11th edition and not issuing a new 12th edition. One of the upcoming revisions is likely to be the incorporation of traffic control device content from the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines. That was a final rule late last year. But before that can be incorporated into the MUTCD, both the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice have to do rulemaking to adopt PROWAG as a federal regulation. And then once it's adopted, the FHWA can proceed with developing and doing rulemaking on a revision of the MUTCD. It would not surprise me to find out that future revisions are targeted on specific issues. So for example, I talked about the document on setting speed limits. When that document becomes available, there may be a MUTCD rulemaking that just focuses on that one issue instead of trying to address a wide range of issues. And so at this point, let me try and get into a few additional questions that were submitted. I wasn't sure if I'd have time to get into all of these, but things are moving along nicely. To the extent I could, I hoped I have already addressed some of your questions. I will say that some of the questions that some of you submitted are really too detailed for this forum, and we're trying to keep this at a high enough level to move along from one topic to the next and to cover a lot. There is no Cliff Notes version of the MUTCD. A lot of these questions are not simple questions, or a lot of questions dealing with traffic control devices are not simple questions to answer. And so with what's left, Cameron, why don't we move on into some of our questions?
Great, thanks, Gene. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It seems like we have 14 minutes left here, so we should have time to get through all the questions that we had prepared here from what folks submitted beforehand. First one being, where can you buy a printed copy of the MUTCD?
All right, so in the last, I don't know, three weeks or so, AASHTO, ATSA, and ITE have begun distributing printed copies of the 2023 or 11th edition. I use those two terms interchangeably, 2023 MUTCD and 11th edition of the MUTCD. You can go to any of those organizations and order the MUTCD. I forgot what the price is. I'm a member of a couple. Actually, I qualify for member prices on all three of those organizations, and I think it was $100 to $110 or $120 for the member price, and it's more for non-members. What I will say is these are pretty high quality versions. This is my newly acquired, and you can see how thick it is, MUTCD that I got last week, the week before. These three organizations printed their versions using the original artwork. So it's not a case of they downloaded the PDF off the FHWA website and sent that off to a printer. They
Hey, Gene, it looks like we've lost audio for you.
All right.
And you're
I
back.
thought I might have hit a mute button on my headset. They actually were working with the original artwork that they acquired from FHWA. The other thing about this document, if you order it from these three organizations, is that there is an index at the end of the document. And there is no index in the official MUTCD. I will say you can order copies of the MUTCD online through bulk providers. I won't mention names, but you probably all know who I'm talking about. Those are printed by vendors that were using the PDF files. All right, let's go on to the next one. Cameron?
What is the current status of the MUTCD's supporting documents?
So we got a number of questions related to stuff that goes with the MUTCD, and I'll address some of these to the extent I can. And I can't give you specific dates on anything, but the standard highway signs, it is an FHWA document, and FHWA has said that they are working on producing that document, and they will likely roll it out in chapters. So, and I don't know which one will come first, but for example, they'll post the regulatory or warning sign, standard sign chapter first, and then they'll do the others as they become available. I would expect those to be rolled out over the summer, maybe into the fall. They also have said that they will produce some training slides, which are essentially PowerPoint slides that cover the main changes from the 2009 to the 2023 MUTCD. Currently, there is a list of known errors in the MUTCD on the FHWA website. That list of known errors is dated December of last year. They have a more updated list, but it hadn't made it to the website yet. Um, because this is a federal regulation, FHWA cannot go and just edit the PDF and say, oh, that word's misspelled, we'll just respell it. Even to correct a misspelling, they have to go through rulemaking. So one of the revisions that comes up, and it'll, I would think, likely be the first revision, they will quote unquote fix as many of these known errors as they can. And you're probably asking, why is it taking FHWA so long to get all this material posted? Well, it took a lot of effort to get just the 2023 MUTCD ready so they could, and the supporting documentation for the final rule. They have been working on these other documents ever since, as along with doing a lot of briefings to elected officials and others that are wanting updates on this new manual. And the levels of review that this material has to go through is pretty extensive. So all of the review processes take a lot of time. There are also other organizations that have documents that relate to the MUTCD. A couple of them came up in the questions. One of them is a Traffic Control Devices Handbook. That is an ITE publication, and so ITE would be responsible for making decisions regarding updating that. And I know ITE is actually creating some space on their website that is specifically focused on the MUTCD, and they're planning to roll out a lot of MUTCD specific content. AASHTO is responsible for the Green Book, or the Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. It references the MUTCD. It doesn't repeat MUTCD content. AASHTO has contracts out, and they're working on an updated version of the Green Book, and have been for some period of time. So I would hope that when that's published, it addresses the content in the 2023 MUTCD. All right, Cameron, let's do the next one.
Thanks, Gene. Looks like we'll have time for maybe one more here. Curious how the MUTCD incorporates the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines.
All right, and so the simple answer is MUTCD is a traffic control device standard. So it doesn't address ADA or PROAG. Right now, it doesn't address PROAG at all. Now, there are aspects of PROAG that relate to the use of traffic control devices. And to the extent that there are those provisions in PROAG, those will be incorporated into the MUTCD in a future revision of the MUTCD. But the MUTCD does not address geometric design of roads or infrastructure design like a curb ramp. And so those issues are not covered in there. And let's go ahead and do one more, Cameron. This one will go fast. And
does the MUTCD apply on private property?
And if you look in the MUTCD and in the Code of Federal Regulations, both of those say yes, the MUTCD applies to private roads open to public travel. So shopping center parking lot, certain parts of it, or a private road that anyone can drive down at any time without restriction. The federal government says that those have to comply with MUTCD. In some places, the state law may change the extent to which that happens. And I think we only have one more question. You want to try and
do it quickly.
fit
Let's
it
do it.
in? All right.
How are emerging micromobility modes addressed in the MUTCD?
And so they're really not, because this is emerging and developing technology. The definition of a pedestrian was revised and basically added the underlined text there, which is not, it basically broadened the definition to mean whatever a local agency wants it to mean, while the definition of a vehicle is the same. So my interpretation to some degree, and I haven't looked at this in a lot of detail, but a lot of these devices, which can, in many cases, can travel at speeds approaching 20 miles an hour, are actually vehicles. It appears that way at face value. And so I think this is something that will be hashed out as we move forward and gain more experience with those. So Cameron, you want to wrap things up?
Let's do it. Thank you, Gene, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope this hour had some valuable information for you to take back to your work and share with your colleagues. Please feel free to visit mutcd.kittleson.com for more information on the MUTCD, on its history, and on its application. The QR code shown on the top right here will take you to that site. Stay tuned for more articles and webinars on this topic and others from Kittleson by subscribing to our newsletter, Streetwise. You can do so at kittleson.com. Thanks again.
Thank you all.